Hi everyone, this is Priyanka Kishore from Asia Decoded. Thank you for tuning into our podcast today. I'm delighted to be joined today by not just one but two illustrious personalities. Between them, they bring a wealth of information on India and China, which I'm very excited to share with you today. First, we have Bert Hofman, whose Substack post on the OECD long term scenarios has actually inspired today's episode. Bert has had an extensive career across Asia, most of it focused on China. He served as the World Bank's country director for China between 2014 and 2019, and later as director of the East Asia Institute at the National University of Singapore. He is currently a non resident senior fellow at the EAI. Joining Bert and me is Niranjan Rajadhyaksha. Niranjan's deep understanding of India comes from his distinguished career in academia and journalism. He was the executive director of the leading financial daily Mint in India and research director at the IDFC Institute. He is currently executive director at the policy consultancy Artha Global, where he guides its research programs, and he was a key architect of Artha's Road to Viksit Bharat report, where they have outlined pathways that India could adopt to become a developed economy. Welcome to the podcast, Bert and Niranjan. And without much ado, let me turn towards you, Bert. To begin with, to set the scene, could you please lay out for our listeners what the OECD long term scenario actually is? And in particular, why do they expect that India will overcome China in terms of GDP by 2060?
Well, thank you, Priyanka. Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be on your show. And quite frankly, the OECD publication gave me time to reminisce about my very early career in the early 90s when I joined the World Bank, when there was a lot of debate about China and India. At the time, China and India were just about the same size economically. They had the same level of GDP, almost the same level of GDP per capita, and there was a lot of discussion on, well, where would this go in the competition? And I visited India a number of times on conferences, China, India. Well, that got a little bit out of fashion, but now we're actually looking uh, uh, to the end of this century, and things have changed. And what the OECD does, I mean, the OECD is it's not a projection, it's not a forecast, it really is a scenario. And this particular scenario they bring about in the context of climate change. They need to know these very long-term scenarios to understand what the effects would be on climate change. So that's the origin of it. Those scenarios they work quite mechanistically, but smart mechanistically, if you want. A lot of it is demographics, and that is the biggest driver in, if you want, to catch up in the overtaking of India, because China is already facing demographic decline. Their population is declining already a little bit now, but especially the second half of this century, it will be quite rapidly. And by the end of the century, the central projection is that they have less than half of the population, 630 million people. Right now it's 1.4. Whereas India will continue to increase its population until about the mid of the century, and then it will decline. By the end of the century, it will be just about where it is today, about 1.4 and a bit billion. And that's really the main driver. Because if you then translate that into labor force, how many people are actually at work? Well, China is less than 300 million, whereas India is 700 million. The way these projections work is then, okay, well, then they look at, well, we need to look at effective labor. So how productive are these people at work? And that they have a model that they have tested and it is estimated, but it's fairly simplified, of course, because they want to do it for many countries. And they basically say, look, we're doing a catch-up model. So the productivity catches up with the most productive entity, in this case, the United States. And that country also grows a little bit in efficiency at 1.3% a year. That's historically proven. So you sort of have a race to catching up. And the better you are in structure, and structure is defined as policy structure, the faster you catch up. Second, the more you are behind, the faster you catch up. as well. So India is behind and has about the same behind China. So they're catching up faster. And they have about the same level of structural parameters as the OECD calls it. So that's why they catch up faster than China. So with much more population, a bit faster catch up, India will overtake China. Again, it's mechanistic. This is projections. This is potential. Sorry, these scenarios. This is potential. It's not yet reality. And that's what we're going to talk about, I'm sure.
Yeah, fair enough. But still, it's good to have the dynamics in place as we start talking about that. And so let's come to Niranjan with that. And Niranjan, this is not the first time we're talking about India's demographics, or to be more precise, effective demographics or demographic dividends. And they have continually disappointed, right? Historically, are there reasons to believe that this is going to change going forward? Labor's contribution to India's growth will increase in line with the size of its working population, what it should be. What's your take on it?
Yeah, thank you, Priyanka, for inviting me and allowing me to share airtime with Bert. Uh, it's an indisputable fact that India is has a demographic advantage right now. If you look at something like the median age of India, it's about 28 years, and there's a long way to go before it, reaches 40, etc. The second is that most projections show that the Indian labor force is not going to peak in the next 15, 20 years. So that is the demographic advantage or the demographic dividend. But I think there is still work to be done to actually translate that into higher economic growth. So a couple of things. The question, as Bert also said, is what is the effective labor force? And India, there are two structural problems. We know that female labor force participation rates are very low, abysmally low, if I may use a slightly more stronger adjective. And second is a lot of work which is caught in the national surveys is actually forms of casual work, disguised unemployment, people working on family farms, family enterprises, often without being paid for it. So the effective labor force actually is far lower. So one way I look at it, Priyanka, is that if India were at this point optimizing its demographic dividend, then historical example shows us that national savings rate and especially household savings rate peak along with this demographic transition. It's not happening in India, which suggests that the effective labor force or the ability to use this demographic dividend is still not done properly. So yeah, so it's an indisputable fact that there is a opportunity, the potential of a demographic dividend. Some of it is playing into the Indian growth story. I wouldn't say that it has no role to play, but nevertheless, as I said, more work to be done. Simple thing again, if you look at any recent growth decomposition exercise, so basically, how much of Indian growth is coming from addition to labor force, addition to capital stock, and productivity growth, TFP growth. You see that even today, despite this young population, much of the growth is being driven by capital accumulation and productivity growth, and not the contribution to labor is lower than what it should be. So I think all these facts sort of suggest that there is more work to be done.
I completely agree with you, but the numbers are striking, as Bert has said. But let me just also come back to you, Bert. In the post itself, you highlight certain points, right? You say that the OECD does not take into account the advances in automation and robotics that are happening in China, and as you said, effective labor, right? So the efficiency gains themselves could negate some of the shrinking labor supply impact. But what if I take a step back and just ask you a more fundamental question, which has also come up repeatedly in debates, that is China truly past the Lewis turning point? Is it not willingly restricting mobility of labor in rural areas and not letting that labor come in?
Well, in terms of labor force joining the modern sector, sure, it still has. In terms of peak labor supply, that's already way gone. So the last decade already, there is a decline in the labor force simply because people stay longer in school. But if you look at the labor that is now left in the countryside, look, a lot of it, frankly, will never make it to the urban areas, those that can already have. And we're now looking at a large part of labor. The average farmer is now well over 50. And so it's very hard to imagine that they would still make the transition. It's their children that make that transition. And that's what you see in the labor force. So rapidly now you see a modernization of agriculture, a lot because now the aged farmers, if you want, they're going to retire. They're not moving to the city; they're retiring, and so that's the demographic dividend in that sense. The Lewis turning point has been passed. Now, what the productivity will bring in terms of robotization, in terms of AI, it's a bit speculative. And frankly, even the experts, even Nobel Prize winner, well, the Nobel Prize winner, the Asamoah is actually quite pessimistic. He says, well, not that much. And others say it is a complete revolution, and it's the realization of John Maynard Keynes' dream that we only need to work, 2 days a week, and we still have all of our income, and the rest we can listen to classical music. So what that is going to be, I think, is a little bit uncertain. But what is it will apply to both India and China. So in that sense, it doesn't make that much of a difference in the competition. And on India, let me say one or two things because I'm absolutely no expert, but I did in preparation for this. I looked a little bit at the numbers, and there's such obvious potential for catch up. One of them, big difference, is the labor participation for women. It's very low in India, could be much higher. Education for women is also much lower. There's a little bit of room still to accelerate the catch up in terms of investment rate. Now, I see now India has a current account deficit, and there's sort of, if you want, right now there's stretch, but you could get the savings rate up. It's about 30% of GDP. In China, it's 44% of GDP, which is too much, but a little bit more could happen there as well. And then the final thing, where China has been tremendously effective, is the transfer of foreign technology. And of course, China has used FDI very, very well. They have used foreign invested firms very well to basically catch up much faster than they would normally do. Final word, but there India is truly not that bad in terms of the average education per laborer. India scores relatively well on their human capital. They're just about where you would expect them to be given their per capita income. But again, China around this time, and that is 25 years back for China, they started heavily investing in university education, in and vocational education, to create the labor force that is now, if you want, fitting into this very different economy. And I think that's where India can also look and see what the opportunities are.
That's a great point, Niranjan. You have written about the need for education to be more effective, not just in terms of just getting through school years, but actually the quality
Yeah.
of education that comes through. But there's also this other point, and we are talking of in some sort of tension between, at least in India's case, automation versus the need for low skilled jobs, and there is a line of thought that manufacturing is too capital intensive in India, and so it is not able to create enough jobs for the labor pool that is currently available before the upgrade that Bert is advising gets into play. And so, do you think, with the government leaning even more on industrial policy, which is sort of following the China path of attracting manufacturing in FDI, in capital intensive manufacturing, we are going to see an increased tension between these two objectives because with the kind of demographic we have, if we don't have good enough jobs, then that leads to other kind of challenges.
Absolutely fair point. I think India is, in a way, I think what Arvind Subramaniam and Devesh Kapoor mentioned in their recent book, like a precocious model, right? That we've done services before manufacturing, high end manufacturing before low end manufacturing. They also say that we've had political democracy before we've had a certain level of income. So it's a very different type of economic trajectory. On capital intensity, I think this has been a problem not just now, but through Indian economic history over the past 50, 60 years. I think the choice is not just between labor intensive and capital intensive manufacturing. I think what has always been an issue right from the first Indian 5 year plans, and today, as you say, in the industrial policy, is between India's urge to acquire depth in certain key intermediate goods so that it has geopolitical autonomy, right? So in the 50s, we went and invested in machine tools and in steel plants rather than in textiles and footwear. It's happening again today in some different form, So I think there is that thinking in the Indian establishment which has been steady across the centuries. The other thing is that, so India, given its state of development, I think it needs far more labor intensive manufacturing. I don't, beyond the point, I don't know how much government policy can push it, because it's actually a firm level decision, right? The choice of technology. And we know the entire story that, labor laws are a problem. Some people say, India's exchange rate has been overvalued, so therefore it loses out competitiveness. But I also want to point out this, that India is such a vast country that it's not an either or, need not be an either or uh, uh, choice, you see, because in like we have states like Tamil Nadu down south, which are perhaps on par with the ASEAN countries in terms of their economic development and social development. And then we have certain states like Bihar, which still are way behind. It's almost like a 5x differential in per capita income. So India can actually, straddle the value chain in a way. There are parts of the country which can do high-end manufacturing. There are parts which are suited for really, the sort of uh, game which Bangladesh succeeded in, right? Where just basic garments, basic, consumer goods. So I think that the complexity of India allows it, and the size allows it to straddle both, but in general, yes, we need more labor intensive manufacturing. If I may almost also just cycle back a bit to something which Bert said about the OECD model. So Bert, I know this is like a bunch of economists talking about Cobb Douglas functions, etc. But I was just going through that OECD report as well, and I found that the model which they have used is the same across all countries, right? So, and they have taken that elasticity of labor, that parameter at 0.67 for all countries. Actually, empirically in India, it is closer to 0.51, So, uh, when I actually, just quick calculation, it makes a big difference to India's potential growth. What is that, 1 minus alpha or whatever you call it. I'm sorry, you have to excuse this slightly weird detour into the
That's
mechanics of
great.
Cobb Douglas. But so I think that one of the points I noticed about the OECD model is, I know it's a it's a they're trying to think through it, so it's not, they're not saying it's a rigid forecast. So I think they have, that labor elasticity they have overestimated as far as India goes. But yeah, coming back to the labor issue, I think uh, the PLIs also, if you see, which is the production linked incentive schemes, which is India's version of industrial policy, they have a mix of these key intermediate goods like pharma APIs, like semiconductors, which India thinks it needs to make at home. And then they have certain classical labor intensive textiles type of things, and frankly, the only success we've seen till now is in mobile phone assembly, right? Now, that's the only success story. And it's still up in the air how much of that is because of the fiscal incentives and how much is it because of other drivers. So I think, whatever our preferences, I think we are going to see this sort of mixed strategy throughout. I don't think India is going to do a Bangladesh and just go all in with labor intensive manufacturing, or what maybe Korea did in the 50s, or what Malaysia did later.
And I think that that's interesting. It's just finding the right balance, but that's what we are just discussing scenarios here. Now, but before I bring us to the current geopolitics, do you want any last word on the Cobb Douglas? You
Look,
can.
I mean, it's a very nice point. I didn't even mention the word Cobb Douglas because I was afraid, but um, it's a fair point. But the same holds for China because China's share of labor in GDP is also less than 0.67. So right now it's a bit below zero point 0.5. So you would also have different equilibria. Also, the other part, the very big difference, and I've been thinking about that a lot, is that China, in part because of its industrial policy, but because of its decentralized industrial policy, they probably haven't used all their capital all that well. So then you would say, well, if you were to think about that in Cobb Douglas terms, you would say, well, capital has depreciated more rapidly than in most other countries. Why is that? Because a lot of it was driven by policy choice, some of it was driven by property bubbles. And you say, well, so the capital stock is not just adding up the previous year's investment. A lot of that did not create productive assets. So if you're going to refine it, I think those are very important refinements, of course, and you'll get a different results. But nevertheless, and maybe we're looking at India not twice the size of China by the end of the century, which is quite remarkable. But surpassing it, the demographics almost tell you that. And even now, yes, India is far less productive than China, but if you look at it in PPP terms, it's a bit less than half per employee. So that's not way behind. It is, yes, it's less, and obviously there's a lot of upward potential, but that means that growth can be much more rapidly. So you'd still see that at some point India is most likely to be the largest economy, almost no matter how you see it. The question is much more when.
And that ties into the title of this podcast: is the rise inevitable? But I'll just staying with China's growth model because it is hitting limits in different ways, right? We've been talking about demographics, but one thing that has happened, and just pulling the conversation more towards what we are in right now in terms of the tech race between US and China, and I think we can broadly agree that the sort of measures that the US put on China pushed it to up its tech game, its automation, and became very competitive very quickly in exports. And those exports are now flooding the global markets because of under consumption challenges at home. There's an excess capacity problem. Most people would say, love to hear your take on it. But more importantly, can China keep growing like this? What is the end game here? Because if they're not able to lift consumption, at what point do they actually run into a global resistance against their manufacturing superpower? And then what is the growth model?
Well, I think on that last part, we have already seen growing resistance from developing countries as well as developed countries. I mean, the US China tensions are in the headlines, but really it's across the board. And it's the EU, but I live now in Indonesia. You have, on the one hand, very much welcome Chinese investment. On the other hand, they're very nervous about Chinese manufacturing and on how cheap it is. So that's, I think, a political issue for China. If I read the tea leaves, and this is the party, the Communist Party has now made recommendations to the government to the 15th five-year plan. It will be published next week to pay attention to that, i.e., they need to have more consumption, they need to have more investments abroad into manufacturing into those places to which they now export. So, how rapid that goes, but they clearly have seen an issue. My issue that I see, or issue, I think it's fair to say that China in the past 15, 20 years hasn't been maximizing the welfare of the average Chinese citizen. They have been maximizing the power of the Chinese economy and the Chinese state, and they have betted big on manufacturing, more so since geopolitical competition started to play a role. Technological competition is fairly recent, but they have China started investing in high tech well before the competition with the United States. And frankly, in some they succeeded, and some they failed, and they failed terribly in internal combustion engines, for instance, big strategic industry in the early 2000s that basically failed to develop it. But they could use that technology and a lot of the knowledge for producing electric vehicles, where I have to say China can all give us a master class in industrial policy in this particular sector. At the same time, at the tail end, into implementing it, China runs into this problem of industrial policy at the local level because China doesn't have one industrial policy. I always say China has maybe 30 or maybe 300, depending on whether you look at the province or whether you look at the city level. And so you see a lot of duplication, a lot of cities and provinces that want to have their own electric vehicle, that want to have their own solar energy plant, and that gives basically a lot of waste. And then the surpluses of that production, yes, they need to find a way, and some of it will go abroad. I think the issue would not have come to the fore that much if there wouldn't have been the strategic competition and the geopolitical tensions that have risen. Frankly, not so much because of China's fault, but because of Russia's fault and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That has put geopolitics and national security to the forefront. So, Europe could have said, well, it's wonderful to get all this cheap stuff from China, and hey, they want to subsidize. It's great because they subsidize the European consumer. But if you need the tanks, if you need the rockets, if you need the steel to defend yourselves against a potential action of the Russian Federation, you must have that industry. And so it starts to become very prominent, the need for having certain industries that are very much adjacent, if you want, to military industries. And that's a pity. I wish that the world were different, but I think that's the stage where we're in now. So part of the noise, part of the objection against the surpluses is really the fear of destroying the industries at home that are needed for national security reasons.
And in ASEAN, though, there is a different reason, right? And because you're sitting in Jakarta and I'm sitting in Singapore, there is a cheap influx of cheap Chinese goods in the low value added industries as well. And so I think the reasons for pushback, to whatever extent this region might push back, are slightly different, right? The China shock that's playing out in ASEAN is very different from the China shock that's playing out in Europe. And at this point of time, because ASEAN is not as competitive as China in manufacturing, they might get by. But I think this will be a source of friction, if not conflict, within Asia going forward.
I fully agree. But the positive side is that China has been investing quite a bit in manufacturing in Southeast Asian countries, including in Indonesia. 10 years ago, that was a lot of infrastructure related. Now it is truly manufacturing. And in Indonesia, it matches the local industrial policy, which puts a big bet onto natural resource related industries, particularly nickel, but copper and others as well, and hopefully Indonesia very much hopes that they find rare earth somewhere, and then they invite investors to say, look, if you want to have our copper or our nickel, you also need to build a smelter, and you also need to start producing batteries here because that's what we'd like to see. So they use their natural resource advantage as a springboard for industrial development. That won't be in all industries, but for now, they actually get some benefits. And China has been very receptive of that argument, and so they've been investing, and it's gradually spreading to others as well. At the same time, other industries such as textiles have not done very well, and that is because of China and other places as well, but because of China. Just to bring that point home, China, and like India, frankly, is not either or. But if you look at China, one of the remarkable things is that their share in world markets in all the sectors that they're active in have been increasing. And be it textiles, because you can say textiles, that should be in Bangladesh or in Myanmar. But yes, it is. But actually, in terms of value added, it's still China that has been, well, it's now leveling off, but they're still by far the largest producer. So, and that's in part because they had so much labor to get from the countryside. And now you see a lot of production processes being automated, maybe even a bit ahead of the economic rationale, but being automated, robotized, and therefore they remain competitive in those traditional sectors where they're also forging ahead in the more cutting edge sectors. It's quite remarkable. But I think that that can apply equally to India because India has the same level of labor force. So there's the economic space, the product variety that India could efficiently produce is vast.
Niranjan, feel free to respond to Bert, but I also want to shift a bit to services because eventually the OECD, which is the basis for this discussion, it's talking about the end of the century. It's talking about 2100, and arguably, that's when services will have a much bigger role to play in economies than manufacturing, at least in many economies. And one could say India as a hedge here. But we've just concluded a AI Impact Summit, AI Summit, a global AI summit. And while it has attracted a lot of attention for good reasons, there's also sort of fueled this concern that it's going to eat away our existing IT services, the low value testing work that we do, et cetera, et cetera. How do you view it? Do you see AI as an existential threat to the BPO and the business services industry that we have built, or do you see that enabling India moving up the services chain value or services value chain?
So yeah, that's a tough one, right? The simple answer is everyone's trying to figure out, and I'm in the same camp. And it's early days. Uh, don't exactly know how this AI story is going to uh, play out. So that said, uh, the concerns are there. Means if you've just seen how software services stocks have underperformed the market, not just in the past week or 10 days, but over the past 6 months. There are genuine concerns about the sort of basic coding work which software services companies in India are doing, uh, whether they will survive the AI wave. But I just want to make 2 points, perhaps disconnected points. The first is, you know, on the macro side, if let's say that the software exports industry or software exports don't increase by much or even flatline, I don't think it's going to be a massive shock to the balance of payments, right? I mean, assuming that it's not completely decimated, I think India can absorb this. The bigger question is that also software employs about 5 million people. It's been an escalator of social mobility, but in terms of India's overall labor force, it's not as dominant as some people think. So I think that I would, be a little less panicky about the immediate macro implications. About the longer term issue, see, there are two things, Priyanka. First is, I don't think job is the right unit of analysis. I think all our jobs are a continuum of tasks, right? We do 10, 15, 20 things in our jobs. My guess is that there'll be some tasks which will be automated away. Some tasks actually where productivity will be augmented. So it a lot depends on, the type of tasks which we carry out in our daily lives as professionals. So to believe that entire jobs will disappear, I would still, hold my horses on that one. And the third thing is that, see, there's like an idea of technology overshoot. Sometimes technology moves faster than the ability of firms to absorb that technology in productive ways. We saw it, you know the famous Solo paradox, when Robert Solo said sometime in the 80s that we see computers everywhere but in the productivity statistics. I think what the underlying message is that the technology is there, but actually for it to meaningfully change productivity or change the operations of companies, it's a much longer process, and it actually starts showing up only later. So I think sometimes technology overshoot happens. Companies, like all institutions, are slower to adapt to new ways, and when they adapt, they may need Indian software companies. So I feel we should be a little careful. I'm not dismissing these concerns, they are genuine, but I would argue against the really panicky or doomsday view that you know by like next year, all these companies are going to be decimated. uh, there's this interesting argument among economists. Darren Acemoglu and company have pretty dark view of AI. But then there's someone like David Otter who basically believes that AI will actually help build the middle class, the working class. So we don't know. So it's a big. Definitely, it's a technology which is going. It's like what we call a general purpose technology, right? It's the same. It actually filters into all areas of economic life. So it is like electricity, it is like the railways, it is like the internet. But I think it's going to play out over a longer time frame than what some of the more pessimistic scenarios or pessimistic analysts are saying. So yeah, so that's the AI thing. Just to go back to the geopolitics, I think that's also going to be another one is climate change. Actually, the entire OECD report is embedded. The basic issue is climate change, and therefore these long-term economic scenarios. But I think how the geopolitics plays out and how India also adapts, because the chances that this is going to lead to a fragmentation of the world in terms of zones of influence, is quite high. So uh, in just by the pure old classical classroom gravity model of trade, India and China should be natural trading partners, right? Two large economies sitting next to each other. They are big partners, but there is now concerns in India about the size of the trade deficit, about Chinese FDI, that in which sectors should it be allowed. I think now there's a slight softening of positions on both sides on this. So India has to actually balance between the fact that there is a large economic power, very almost in the same region, but we have a border dispute and general geopolitical competition, and the fact that as a democracy, as as a middle power or whatever, it has certain common interests with Europe and America, which is why these FTAs, they've after 91 we had this entire look east policy. Now we seem to be pivoting to a look west policy in the middle of all this global uncertainty. So I think how India plays this, because it's not a small country, it has to, it cannot cut off its options by being in one camp or the other. So that will have implications on our economic strategy and economic future.
Hey, it is not in one camp. It is in every camp or no camp, depending upon the situation and the headlines
Exactly,
of the day.
exactly.
But that's an interesting discussion, and in fact, we don't talk enough about services in China, right, Bert? But services is big in China. I was seeing it's close to 57% of GDP or something like that. And
Right.
why don't we talk about it? Why, do you think that this resurgence of manufacturing that we were talking about, and China is actually talking about AGI. It's on the next level of AI. It's talking about general artificial intelligence, which just takes over everything. And so, do you think that services will slowly petter away in China? There will be a manufacturing powerhouse.
Well, so as you noted, service is now the largest sector in the economy, and if you look at where are the jobs being created, it's in services, it's not in manufacturing, which is quite remarkable. Um, It is a question, though. Sort of a lot of the services that we're now seeing as high value services in finance, in medical and others, a lot of them are also quite prone to AI and being replaced by AI. So there is a bit of a dilemma at that level. If you look at the demand side, as people get richer, they are demanding more of what they feel is largely a services product. So naturally, you would say that shifts to the services sector. But I said the how exactly that's going to play out, AI is an important part of that because yes, there's only going to be one violin playing the violin concerto or Beethoven or somebody else, but uh, a lot of services could be very easily automated. The financial service I already mentioned, and that is quite interesting. I feel in terms of a policy point of view because I mean, there's two policies that governments need to think about. One is, well, to what extent do we need to be part of this AI production? So, how far do we need to have our own AI, our own AGI? And the other is, how do we help our labor force adapt? I think China is quite well, and frankly, it was not so much of a policy, but it was non-state actors that came up with AI that were not even subsidized. If you're on DeepSeek is the most famous one. Well, DeepSeek was basically a financial services firm that didn't see much of a future anymore in being a hedge fund in China because Chinese leadership has said that we don't want necessarily the financial sector to get rich. Whether they are coming back from that remains to be seen. But they then started looking at their skill set and they said, well, gee, we've basically been doing something that others would call AI. So let's give that a push. And that's how DeepSeek originated. Of course, I'm simplifying. But it's quite interesting to see that this very innovative part, Alibaba is big there, Tencent's a big there. They're all in the private firms that are doing that are making the progress. China, in terms of policy, they've made an interesting choice because they said, look, irrespective of what happens with the models, whether it's going to be AGI or not, what we want is to be AI to be useful for society. So they put a lot of emphasis on the diffusion of that technology, on the adoption of that technology. And it is their official policy. I think that is quite remarkable. The second aspect of it is really the labor force. And I said, frankly, I'm not even worried about myself. With the pleasure of AI, my lifetime employment is going to be much longer because I don't need to do all that grunt work anymore. I don't need to do all the coding anymore, which I'm getting worse and worse at in any case. So my AI is doing it already. It's quite remarkable. It's doing it already. Um, but the problem for that is I used to have an RA for that. I still have RAs, but for different things. But a lot of RA entry level jobs are being rapidly replaced by AI, and it's in economics and statistical work, but it's in legal work, and you could even think of in terms of medical work, because if you have your AI telling you what the diagnosis is, you don't need to five assistant doctors to go around and do all the diagnostics for you. So there's a lot of that risk to entry level jobs. And how do you get experienced people that are very productive and who are helped by AI rather than hurt? Well, you need to grow them up. I started as an RA, and that's how I learned to become an economist. So I'm very concerned about that entry level jobs, and it is to some extent reflected. If you look in the US, there's some studies done on advertisement for jobs, and even in software engineers, actually the number of software engineers demanded hasn't declined despite the enormous capabilities of AI, but it's all experienced software engineers. So those entry level jobs, I think, is a real issue, and that is, I think, a subject for policy. So you could say, look, we need to create pathways, be it through subsidies, regulation, through systems, such as, say, the German apprentice system, to have those pathways in which people become the most productive members of society as they can be. And those are the two areas I think China has figured out the first. On the second, they have not yet. Then there is a much bigger question in the long term, and that is about the distributional consequences of artificial intelligence. I don't think anybody has sorted that out yet, but that could be if indeed we don't have to work at all anymore, or only a little bit, and I would just be managing my farm of AI agents that do all the work for me. How do you distribute the wealth created? How do you distribute the value created? It's a big question for us because it used to be work. It used to be work as being the transmission mechanism from effort into output into pay. Well, if you no longer work, how does that work? And that is something that I think we all need to figure out. Uh, Probably only by the end of this century, but it is an important policy question now.
Well, I'm hearing is that I need to get both of you back just to talk about AI for India and China. And I would love to continue talking, but I'm conscious of everybody's time here. So let me just try to close this. We had a fascinating conversation. I loved it that we went into some nerdy stuff and then we came back to ground earth and talked about some of the developments. But let's just go back, and you've already probably answered this. I know you have answered this in your own ways, but to pinpoint, then in some sense, both of you, are you saying that this India versus China and whether India becomes twice the size of China or China's demographics actually inevitably lead to it being third? This is more a function of policy choices, at least India has to make, or is it something that they're already on the path of the policy choices they have made? Both of you, whoever wants to go first.
So, if I may go first, see, Priyanka, if look, however you look at it, right? You may say that India's uh, turning point in terms of economic growth. Some people say it's 1980, some 91, or whatever. Means there are all sorts of fancy statistical tools to argue about. But India has basically maintained a steady growth rate of 6.2, 6.3% over this 30 or 40-year period. And this has come across different political regimes, business cycles, global shocks. So I think there is embedded in everything a certain stable growth rate. The question really is, which always I raise, is that this is not to maintain 6.5% growth over 3 decades, 4 decades is not a small achievement, and it has transformed India. The question is that if you look at the really successful economies of East Asia, including Japan and China, at this stage of per capita income, they were doing 9% and 10%. So the question really is, how do you raise this growth rate over the next 2 decades? And that is the policy question. So uh, I don't think that, India's growth rate has peaked. The only question is whether you can push up the potential growth rate higher, by at least a percentage point. And there, of course, policy dynamically adapts to the way the economy matures, right? So what was needed 20 years ago is not, uh, as you said about education, right? 20 years ago the question was, how do you get more kids into school? Now your question is, okay, all kids are in school, how do you actually ensure that they leave with certain level of basic skills? So policy will change dynamically, but I think if you ask me one big question, it is this, that how again India plays or adapts to the changing geopolitical situation. Now, with the rise of protectionism, with the sort of splintering of the global economic order, the attraction of saying that we will be self-sufficient is very, true for any large country. I think India should continue uh, to be an active trade economy, so through the FTAs, through whatever. And there's a macroeconomic reason I say this, besides the usual story of efficiency gains, etc., in the sense that if you want to build an economy purely based on your local domestic demand, then you have to ensure that your labor incomes go up, right? And Priyanka, you have written about this, that the domestic demand is actually, and for all the other Asian countries, exports were a way out. You know, you could actually produce more than your local demand and you could sell to foreign consumers. If that window is closing, you have to have more, labor incomes, but then that squeezes out corporate profits. So I think thinking through this model, in a time of changing global geopolitical realities, is going to be uh, a critical set of policy choices. But underlying all this is my main thing, that India should not turn protectionist. Although there are the new world means that you have to build domestic capabilities in certain industries. You cannot be dependent on large foreign powers on for certain key, again, intermediate goods. I still feel that as an economic model, we should not be protectionist. We should be a trading nation.
But you have the last word.
Goodness. Well, I mean, I'm not going to say anything about India because that's. But let me just say that look, I think China has done really well. They started their hyper growth, if you want, with one big policy move, and that was the entry into World Trade Organization. So, for them, an open trading system remains very, very, very important. And I do think that if you want the geopolitics between India and China, if they can both support though an open multilateral world economy, that would be fantastic. It would be a great public good, a great for India, but also for the rest of the world. And China will do so. China has its own Chinese characteristics. I said their industrial policy has some upward potential. If you want, they could do probably a little bit less of it. They could probably be a bit more understanding of other countries' development strategies. But in a way, this should be India's moment. And from a geopolitical point of view, there is more hesitation with China. Let's just face it, for whatever reason, from the US, but to some extent also from the EU. The EU and India is a very natural match. The EU and Southeast Asia, a very natural match. But also India and Southeast Asia is a very natural match in terms of exchange and in terms of mutual investments and development. So India can play a very important role in this development process of other countries as China becomes richer and richer, and they will be more preoccupied with strategic competition with the United States and other issues. India probably has to be less worried about this, and they can be helpful in development for itself, but also for other countries.
Thank you both. That was a great conversation. I mean, we are talking several years in advance, but and time will be the judge of how this unfolds. But I at least now have some signposts to watch out for. We've talked about the importance of education, skilling, finding the right kind of jobs, but also the importance of being an open economy. Couldn't agree more, and potentially forging closer ties with China, all of which will work in India's favor and could lead to this trajectory happening. So, thank you for putting that out, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did.
Thank you, Priyanka, for inviting.
Thank you.